Good morning, everyone. Thank you. There are a lot of sleepy people I see. They were up last night watching a football game. You know, it's funny, I'm a West Coast guy, grew up in Los Angeles, and I could watch Sunday night football, Monday night football. It's 9 a.m., time for the third round of popcorn. I moved to the East Coast, and I watched my first Sunday night or Monday night football game, and I was exhausted for class. And all the East Coast people said, "Welcome to reality." So I'm glad that the event turned out the right way, because this could be a very different event had it gone the other way. But with that said, my name is Gerard Robinson. I am a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. For several years, I have been a member of the school reform group here with Jamie. I'm always excited to be here in Boston, particularly at the Pioneer Institute, where it's one of the few places in the U.S. where we can have a safe and sane conversation about school reform from multiple perspectives with one goal: to make sure that we educate children who are ready for the knowledge economy and, more important, ready to be active citizens. Today we have an opportunity to have a great conversation. Title is Pathways to Educational Opportunity, Vocational Technical Education, and Liberal Arts. And I think from there we should have a very good conversation. But first, before we get started, let me thank the co-sponsor for today's event. The Massachusetts Association of Vocational Administration, the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History, We the People, the Citizens and the Constitution, the Program for Education, Policy and Governance at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and Tuskegee University, along with Associated Industries of Massachusetts. This event is really an historical debate that began really in the 20th century. And it was framed by two Americans who were both committed to education but took very different standpoints. One was Booker T. Washington. He founded Tuskegee University. He was one of the first leaders to really push the idea that working with both head and hand and heart made a tremendous difference. He had a very different opinion than someone who grew up here in Western Massachusetts, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Being the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard, he later became one of the founders of the Niagara Movement, which led to the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Dr. Du Bois, as a man of letters, was a strong proponent of liberal arts education. And then there was a debate: is it head or is it hand? And there was a big debate of whether the conjunction was or. Should it be one or the other, or should it be and? And we find ourselves many years today still having this important conversation. From a contemporary standpoint, we're still having the conversation regarding liberal arts versus technical education. And thankfully, we have moved a long way since the early 1900s. More students across the board have graduated from high school. Many more are going to and through college, and yet we're having the conversation about what role should it make. When we discuss the role of two great people, you often have to talk about his or her biography, and in this case, it's two great men. Since biographies emphasize place when discussing a subject, let's put into context what it was like in the United States in the early 1900s, in fact, 1900 specifically. William McKinley of Ohio was president of the United States, was later shot and killed in Buffalo, New York in 1901. Vice President Teddy Roosevelt became the president. The Republican Party, the party of Lincoln at that time, was a national party, strong on business and generally more progressive on racial issues at the time. 1900, the Democratic Party was more the conservative party. Big push for states' rights, heavy regional party, mostly in the South, very different views on race, and that was 1900. Where was America in terms of its demography? There were 76 million people in place. In 1900, there were approximately 9 million African Americans, which made up 11% of the population. Not ironically, the majority of them were located in the southern states. In 1900 alone, there were 106 black men who were lynched, and this led to a great push at the local, state, national level to address that issue. Remember, 106 identified. We probably know there were many more than that. And then as we move forward 20 years later, we have the 19th Amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote. And now, with not only in Massachusetts, but nationwide, we have a number of women in positions of power in government, in business, and in civil society. In 1903, the United States was still an economic power. Its economics were primarily driven by looking at our GDP. And while it was growing, there was also a push from England and Germany. And with that, China and India, very different countries today, were growing about 3 times the rate of the U.S. at that time. In 1900, the U.S. also granted the authority to create the Panama Canal. 1903, the Wright brothers in Ohio flew the first gas-powered plane, the Kitty Hawk. In 1903, the Boston Red Sox won the first World Series. Yeah, in fact, one gentleman in the back, when he heard I was going to say this, said he was there. And so, it's good to see him still kicking and moving. We also had George Orwell, Bob Hope, Lou Gehrig, and civil rights leader Ella Baker, all born in 1903. And so a lot was taking place in the beginning of the 20th century. Fast forward to 2015, different country, different demography, but some of the same issues. Is it voc tech education? Is it liberal arts? Is it a mix? At the K-12 level, there's a big push now for STEM, but someone said, why not add the arts, make it STEAM, because that's equally important. So, if we're talking about biography, we have to also talk about the scholars who have written about the men we're going to discuss today, and we're fortunate to have 2 scholars here with us at the Pioneer Institute. I will introduce the first. He will come to the podium, deliver his presentation for about 30 minutes. I will then return to the podium, introduce our second speaker, and then we will have a Q&A with the audience, and then we will go back and forth. Our first speaker is Dr. Robert Norell. He is professor and Bernadette Schmidt Chair of Excellence in the Department of History at the University of Tennessee. He was a Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Studies at the University of Turbin in Germany. Professor Norell was also the author of a widely acclaimed book, Up From History, The Life of Booker T. Washington. He's also the author of numerous books about race and civil rights. In particular, his book, Reaping the Whirlwind, The Civil Rights Movement in Tuskegee, won the Robert F. Kennedy Award in 1986. We're pleased to have him here with us at the Pioneer Institute. I look forward to his remarks, and let's welcome our first speaker, Dr. Norell.
Thank you for those kind words. Let me just say at the outset here, I have a cold, and I will try to go right through this paper, but if I pause to cough for a while, please just go get some coffee or go to the men's room or whatever you need to do. I'll sooner or later stop. Booker T. Washington was born a slave in Virginia in 1856, the son of an illiterate slave woman and an unnamed white father. I said unnamed, not unknown. As a child, he struggled desperately to get an education, and his efforts began to succeed when he got to Hampton Institute in Eastern Virginia in the mid-1870s. He was the school's outstanding product, the man named when people in Tuskegee, Alabama, mostly white people, in 1881 asked for the recommendation for a principal for their new school for freed people. They asked for a white man, and General Samuel Chapman Armstrong said, well, I don't have any white students to send you, but I got a really fine black fellow. And they said, okay, Booker T. Washington will do. In the next 2 decades after its founding, Tuskegee Institute erected 33 buildings, multi-story structures made from red bricks manufactured on the campus. The students had put up the buildings with other materials purchased by the captains of industry, men named Carnegie and Rockefeller and Huntington, all men who counted Booker Washington among the wisest and most competent Americans. All like them, Washington was a builder, except he had done it with a considerable handicap of being black. Beyond the center of the campus were these beautiful red brick buildings, sprawled 2,000 acres devoted to vegetable growing, livestock husbandry, cotton cultivation, scientific farming, much of it overseen by the brilliant and eccentric horticulturalist George Washington Carver. Tuskegee Institute represented the will and determination of Booker T. Washington. There had been nothing not 1 acre of land or 1 building when he arrived, and the only financial support was a small state appropriation. He wandered the countryside on foot to recruit his first students, and when a rapidly growing stream of poor blacks had begun to appear at the Institute, he had put them all to work building it. Having gotten the building process started, Booker then started wandering the nation looking for the money to pay for what he had begun in Alabama. He asked for help so persuasively that his school grew rapidly, and by 1900, Tuskegee was one of the largest institutions in terms of enrollment of higher education in the United States, and certainly the largest in Alabama. In my biography of Washington, I argue that historians have been unfair to him. W.E.B. Du Bois, the Tuskegeans' longstanding rival for leadership among black Americans, survived Washington for nearly a half century and shaped the memory of his avowed enemy. Du Bois said Washington excused the South's discrimination and blamed the poor black man himself for his own predicament. Du Bois blamed Washington for segregation, disfranchisement, and many other ills related to blacks in the South. I found something different when I looked at Washington. Washington made public protest against discrimination on railroads, lynching, unfair voting qualifications, discriminatory funding in education, segregated housing legislation, and discrimination by labor unions. He constantly raised money for black institutions in the South. He arranged and helped finance lawsuits challenging disfranchisement, jury discrimination, and peonage, though he did it all secretly because it was the only way he could do it and survive. And in fact, Washington, I argue, did earlier what the NAACP would successfully do in the years after Washington died. 100 years ago this year he died. Washington emerged as the leader of African Americans after he gave a speech at the Cotton States Exposition in Atlanta in 1895. The passages from this speech that are typically quoted are, quote, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers on the hand, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress." He also said agitation of questions of social equality is the extremist folly. And both of these statements have been quoted profligately ever after to his detriment. Washington believed, but here's my argument about the Atlanta speech. Washington believed that the white man needed to have a different image of blacks from the evil, beast-like reputation that had become embedded in American popular culture since emancipation. As whites, not just in the South, but throughout the country, insisted that in freedom the former slaves had declined in character and morality. The overarching message in Atlanta, if you read the whole speech, was a prophecy of black progress, of movement forward and upward, and of interracial peace. Washington believed that confrontation with powerful, bigoted whites was futile and even suicidal. The other main purpose of the Atlanta speech was to try to thwart the hostility of whites toward any and all black education. In Souls of Black Folk in 1903, Du Bois declared Washington a black leader chosen by whites, and that was a leading condemnation he offered. In fact, Washington was selected in much the same fashion as Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King, a powerful voice who got the attention of whites at the same time that he earned the respect and admiration of African Americans by helping them, that is, helping African Americans imagine a better future, to give them hope. Hope's the ability to imagine your own better future. Du Bois said Washington, quote, practically accepted the alleged inferiority of the Negro race and asked blacks to forego political power, civil rights, and higher education, none of which was true, and Du Bois knew it. if Du Bois did not understand the purpose of the propaganda that Washington was preaching at all times of interracial peace. He may have been the only black man in the South in 1903 so obtuse, and of course there was nothing stupid about Du Bois. He pushed relentlessly, Du Bois did, the false charge that Washington opposed all higher education. Washington sat on the boards of liberal arts colleges, Fisk and Howard, perhaps the two leading black liberal arts colleges at the day. He preferred to hire for Tuskegee teachers from the good liberal arts schools, especially the Ivy League. If a black person could put a liberal arts education to good use, he always said, then he should pursue it. Understand me, he told Tuskegee students in 1895, I am not now, nor have I ever been, opposed to any man or woman getting all the education they can. It mattered not where or how they got it, but what they are going to do with it. At the current stage of black development, he said, all education should advance the race's material conditions. He said, it should work, quote, in the direction of filling up our stomachs, in supplying food, shelter, and raiment, something that we can lay by for the rainy day. Quote, I would say to the black boy what I would say to the white boy. Get all the mental development that your time and pocketbook will afford, the more the better. But the time has come when a larger proportion, not all, for we need professional men and women, of the educated colored men and women should give themselves to industrial or business life. But after the Civil War, the great mass of Southern blacks had little practical use for collegiate liberal arts education. Nearly all of them first needed a primary school education. Tuskegee was established to train primary school teachers who would go into the rural South and build and operate schools for black children who were otherwise being neglected. Southern states had typically not established public school systems until after the Civil War, and the efforts to educate blacks in the post-war years were violently opposed by Southern whites. To educate a Negro, it was commonly said, was to ruin a good field hand. The opposition to black education continued into the late 1800s with efforts in every state to separate the school funds by race. That is, money for black students would come only from taxes paid by blacks, and for white children only from white taxpayers. This would have effectively ended public support for black schools. Booker Washington put up a fierce political fight against the separation of school funds, and in state after state, he was able to stop the move to undermine black funding. He succeeded there, whereas he did not succeed in stopping the disfranchisement effort. Black schools, even after that, still received less than a fair share of money, but he managed to keep the discrimination out of the Southern state constitutions. When the Institute was founded as a school to train teachers, industrial education has essentially meant the teaching of good work habits. Washington originally defined industrial training as a combination of mental and manual training that gave the majority of blacks in the South, quote, the only alternative between remaining ignorant and receiving at least a common practical education. Few young blacks could afford education at a residential college, he observed, and even if possible, self-made, self-educated people were more likely to succeed. Washington envisioned for every black community 2 teachers, a man and a woman, trained in industrial education and committed to uplifting the whole community. Quote, let them be teachers not only in the schoolhouses but on the farm, in the flower garden, and in the house as we have a central light whose rays will soon penetrate the house of every family in the community. Tuskegee Institute's growth was enabled by Washington's response to a major reorientation of Northern support for Southern black education. At this time, curricula throughout the United States was shifting away from classical education to a more hands-on, applied commitment to gaining practical knowledge. Colleges moved to an elective curriculum in which students could choose to master a particular discipline at the expense of a unified and liberal curriculum. This was especially encouraged in technological and business fields, but it was also happening in white colleges like Oberlin and Berea, which was integrated, and even Wellesley nearby here, all of whom embraced a Pestalozzian approach for hands-on experiential learning that integrated practical knowledge with academic study. In the 1880s, philanthropists supporting black education began to insist on instruction in particular trades and much less on academic subjects. This reflected white opposition to any classical education for blacks, and the growing influence of, it also reflected the growing influence of large industrialists in the field of educational philanthropy. The money that Washington raised in the first decade came mostly from Boston, from old abolitionist families. By the 1890s, he needed a lot more money, and Mr. Carnegie, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Huntington had a lot of money, and Washington had a keen nose for where the money was. And so he went to the community of industrialists. Washington tapped education foundations committed entirely to industrial education. In 1883, Washington got help from a new fund with a special focus on industrial education created by the textile industrialist Samuel Slater from nearby. The Slater Funds' first $1,000 gift purchased various tools, a windmill, and a horse for Tuskegee Institute. The Slater Funds stipulated that trades education became the main emphasis in the curricula to get its support. At Tuskegee, this meant more trades were taught and more focused commitment was made on the trades. Washington accepted this change, not just to get the Slater money, but because it was necessary to maintain the confidence of other influential white philanthropists. He told his chief financial officer in 1893, quote, "I am quite convinced that donations from the North in the future are going to be more largely than ever devoted to industrial education. I meet this sentiment at every hand." Even with the full commitment made to teaching industrial trades in the early 1890s, Tuskegee required at least half of each student's courses to be academic subjects, on the assumption that most graduates were going to be rural school teachers responsible for the whole curriculum in a 1 or 2 room schoolhouse. In 1897, the railroad tycoon Henry Villard gave Tuskegee $100 in the belief that, unlike Atlanta University, which was teaching blacks a liberal education that Villard believed they were not prepared to receive, the Alabama school would provide no academic training beyond an elementary level. Of course, he was mistaken in that. But when the Tuskegee student wrote to Mr. Villard a letter of thanks for his gift, she revealed that she had studied natural philosophy, ancient history, and algebra. This prompted the self-righteous Mr. Villard to fire off an angry letter to Washington accusing him of a bait-and-switch fraud. Booker had resolved to get the support of rich and powerful men like Villard, but keeping them happy was a hard job. In this context, it's understandable, I think, that Washington publicly emphasized the industrial component of the Tuskegee curriculum, even as he continued to offer liberal arts subjects like history, philosophy, algebra, and the major sciences. One point of of context here. Almost never did a Tuskegee Institute student have the resources to pay for any of his own tuition, and really to pay for any of his own room and board. So they earned their room and board by working at Tuskegee, and Washington then had to raise all of the money for the operations and maintenance budget, which most years was in excess of $100,000, and that's when $100,000 was some real money. In the years ahead, from the 1893, let's say, the Tuskegee curriculum became more bifurcated, its academic and trades purposes more difficult to reconcile. Tuskegee always struggled to balance academic and industrial education, and Washington and his professors constantly discussed how much of what kind of pedagogy should be imposed on students. Washington's answer was something he called dovetailing, which today's pedagogues often term writing across the curriculum, or they did a few years ago. Integrating or making the task of primary educational skills blend or meld with the things they were learning on the farm or in the shop. In 1903, students at Tuskegee revolted against the large number of curricular requirements, and Washington and his staff responded by reducing such academic requirements as Bible study. The philanthropic insistence on industrial education planted the seeds for the resentment of Tuskegee among those that had lost out in the competition for philanthropic money. Atlanta University, on whose faculty Du Bois was serving during these years, lost foundation support, and its administration and faculty blamed Washington for their hard times and the skepticism among wealthy Northerners about their work. The trade's emphasis encouraged a misapprehension of the work of Tuskegee as a trade school rather than a teacher training school. It still mostly produced teachers, though after the turn of the century, it's producing a lot of businessmen as well. To ensure continued success in his fundraising, Washington allowed the false impression to persist. Washington believed that industrial education would reduce white hostility to black education. I'll say something about that in a moment. He was wrong. He was also convinced that teaching specific skills was appropriate to the evolving economic conditions that blacks faced. In response to the seeming hopelessness of the agricultural economy in the early 1890s, Washington began to envision blacks as proprietors of small businesses based on the craft skills that they acquired at industrial schools. He saw the rapid industrialization and urbanization in the United States, and he perceived a burgeoning demand for skilled workers in the generations ahead. He assumed that the nation's dynamic capitalism would need and accept black entrepreneurs. Washington believed that petty bourgeois blacks would settle American race problems. Quote, "Nothing else so soon brings about right race relations between the two races in the South as the industrial progress of the Negro. Friction between the races will pass away in proportion as the black man, by reason of his skill, intelligence, and character, can produce something that the white man wants or respects in the commercial world." Washington's materialist strategy was a bold promise. It marked a sharp departure from the tradition of ideological and constitutional appeals to racial justice, but there was a contradiction. Washington thought blacks in the United States were losing positions in skilled crafts, which he attributed mainly to increased competition from European immigrants. The labor movement threatened black opportunity because nearly all labor unions discriminated totally against blacks. Washington's critics condemned him for rejecting the classical curriculum in favor of industrial education in the souls of black folk. Du Bois alleged that by, quote, "slamming the door of opportunity in the faces of their bolder and brighter minds, the Tuskegee philosophy put their training in the hands of untrained demagogues. Du Bois himself came up with a total of 2,000 black college graduates in about 1900 since the Civil War. And those he designated the talented 10th, though they amounted to a much smaller fraction than a 10th. His higher education graduates accounted for about 1 in every 5,000 American blacks in 1903. Souls of black folk was silent about the fate of the other 4,999, and he gave Booker Washington no credit for his concern with educating the black masses. Washington's materialist attitude held that education without a real-world application was out of place among a developing people, the vast majority of whom needed primary schools and some skills to prepare to make a living. But the more famous Washington became, the more willing were people, black and white, to ignore what he did say and condemn him for what he did not. Washington had a large contingency. I safely claim a big white majority of critics, of white people in the South, were his intense critics. And they understood, these white racist critics in the South, they understood correctly that his strategy of industrial education was inherently, if not openly, a pursuit of black equality. The North Carolina writer, Thomas Dixon, Jr., who wrote what became the Birth of a Nation and was the biggest selling novelist in the country in the first decade of the 20th century, and a vicious racist. Thomas Dixon wrote in 1905 that Booker Washington was preparing blacks not to work in an industrial economy for white men, but, quote, was training them all to be masters of men, to be independent, to own and operate their own industries, and in every shape and form destroy the last vestige of dependence on white men. Amen. He's absolutely right. Every pupil, Dixon said, who passes through Mr. Washington's hand ceases forever to work under a white man. Then, Dixon asked, would Southern whites allow blacks to master the industrial system? Quote, take the bread from their mouths? Dixon said, no. They would do what whites in the North do when the Negro threatens his bread, kill him. And thus I argue that by building an institution that demonstrated blacks' potential for success and autonomy, Booker Washington gave African Americans reasons to have faith in the future. Indeed, his life itself was an object lesson for progress, for hope that black people could rise to something better. Thank you.